this video session on financial management, dividend policies. Financial management comprises of 4 important topics: raising of funds, utilization of funds, maximizing earnings, and distribution of earnings. Financial management is about how companies and corporates raise and manage finance or funds. In raising of funds, the funds can be raised either out of own capital or out of debt capital. Utilization of funds. Utilization of funds can be made for long-term projects or for short-term operating activities. Maximizing the earnings. Maximization of earnings can be measured using earnings per share, return on investment, or return on capital employed. We are going to deal at length about distribution of the earnings, the dividend policy. In distribution of earnings, we have 2 important aspects. One is distribution of dividends and the retention of earnings. This chapter 5 on dividend policies comprises of 3 lessons. Lesson 5.1, dividend policies and factors influencing dividend policy. Lesson 5.2, theories on dividend policy. Lesson 5.3, provisions in Companies Act on dividend payment. Let us begin lesson 5.1, dividend policy and factors influencing dividend policies. In this lesson, you shall be learning what is a dividend, what are the different types of dividends, the dividend policies and their implications and their objectives, the factors influencing dividend policies and the types of dividend policies. What is a dividend? The term dividend refers to that part of the profit after tax that is distributed among the shareholders of a firm. The dividend is basically a return to the shareholders on their investment. Dividend is paid both to equity and the preference shareholders. The dividend on the preference share is a fixed percentage on the nominal value of shares. Let us take for example a 9% preference shareholder will get rupees 9 dividend yield every year, whereas the dividend on the equity shares depends upon the profits of the company. The company, out of its net income, it retains some amount called the retained earnings. The balance is distributed among the shareholders in the form of dividends. So the net income of the company is divided as retained earnings and dividends. The dividends are paid to the shareholders who are the owners of the company. The dividend is declared by the board of directors out of the firm's current and the retained earnings. The dividends can be given in the form of cash dividends, stock dividends, or property dividends. It is not mandatory for a firm to declare dividends. The firm may opt between payment of dividends or retention of earnings. There are different types of dividends. Regular dividend. Regular dividend is paid annually and it is proposed by the board of directors in the annual general meeting and it is approved by the shareholders. What is an interim dividend? Interim dividend is paid between 2 annual general meetings. Whenever a company makes very high profit, it may go in for an interim dividend. A certain percentage of the paid up capital may be paid up between 2 annual general meetings, then it is called an interim dividend. There are other forms of dividend: cash dividend, stock dividend, scrip dividend, bond dividend, property dividend, and liquidating dividend. If the dividend is paid in the form of cash, which is the most common form, it is called a cash dividend. Stock dividend. You must have heard of bonus shares. The existing shareholders get shares instead of cash. Then it is called a stock dividend. So they will not receive any cash dividend. Instead, they will get the shares of the company, which are bonus shares of the company. That is called the stock dividend. Scrip dividend. Scrip dividend is a form of a promissory note or any other document of evidence. The dividend is provided in the form of an instrument. Then it is called a scrip dividend. Bond dividend. If the scrip is for a long-term period, it is a bond. Then it is called a bond dividend. Property dividend. If assets are given instead of the dividend, then it is called a property dividend. Liquidating dividend. When the company which is going on liquidation pays a dividend, it is called a liquidating dividend. Stock dividend refers to bonus issue of shares. Bond dividend is payment of bonds instead of dividend. Property dividend where an asset is given instead of a dividend. So in India, however, we have only cash dividend and bonus dividends. We don't have the other forms of dividends. A dividend policy. Now let us come back to what a dividend policy is all about. A company has to decide how much it has to pay as a dividend out of its earnings. So that is a dividend policy. So the dividend policy, a dividend policy is a policy a company uses to structure its dividend payment. A dividend policy outlines how a company will distribute its dividends to its shareholders. The structures will give details about how often they are going to pay the dividend, when they are going to pay the dividend, how much is going to be paid as dividend, and how it is going to be distributed in the form of a dividend. So there are two options in the dividend policy. The firm can retain profits and the firm can declare the balance as dividends. The question of deciding how much to retain and how much to distribute to the shareholder as dividend is a dividend policy. So dividend policy is about deciding how much to retain as reserves and surplus and how much to pay to the shareholder as a dividend. So retention of dividends, if you retain dividends, it will leave you with more funds. The company will have more cash flow. When you pay dividends, the cash flow of the company will be affected. Let us go to some of the definitions of dividend policy. Weston and Brigham have defined dividend policy as dividend policy determines the division of earnings between the payment to the shareholders and the retained earnings. Gitman, he has defined dividend policy as a firm's dividend policy represents a plan of action to be followed whenever a dividend must be made. Let us go to the next topic, influence of dividend policy. So how does a dividend policy influence a company? A dividend policy influences a company's financing decision. Dividend policy influences the market share prices. It also influences the share prices in the long run. Let us see how. See, when you are going to pay dividends, the distribution of dividends will reduce the cash flow and therefore you cannot go for capital expenses. You will be left with lesser cash for other operations. So therefore, all the financing decisions decide upon the dividend policy. Market price of the shares. When the company pays very high dividend, there is a surge in the market price of shares. People think that the company is paying good dividend and therefore would like to invest in that shares of that company. So therefore, when the company pays good dividend, the market price of the share in the short run increases. Market price of shares in the long run. Some companies, they do not pay high dividends in the short run, but they retain their share profits and therefore their reserves and surplus become very high, which means the retained earnings per share of these companies are very high. So people in the long run, such companies are more preferred because the wealth of the organization is higher, although the short term profits are lesser. So therefore, the market prices in the long run depend upon the wealth of the organization rather than the dividends that are paid. So therefore, the dividend policy affects the financing decision, market price of the shares in the short run and the market price of the shares in the long run. Optimal dividend policy. An optimal dividend policy, the finance managers have to make a very prudent decision in deciding upon what an optimal dividend policy is. So there are four important objectives of a good dividend policy. Low cost of funds. If the company retains the profits, it is zero cost for them. The funds are available at zero cost. However, if they don't pay dividends, their market price of the shares would come down. So they have to balance between procuring low cost funds. Either they can use their own funds or borrow at a low cost. Second, good return to shareholders. The dividend policy should ensure good return to shareholders. If there is no return, the shareholders will not be happy and they may shift to other companies. So next, consistency. Paying high dividend once and low dividends the next year would mean that the companies, they cannot assess the company's performance, and consistency is very important. Wealth maximization. Wealth maximization refers to the total profits that the company has retained or amassed over years. So if the company pays very high dividends every year, leaving less for the reserves, wealth would be lesser. So if they retain more, their wealth would be higher. So they have to balance between the four: cost of funds, good return to shareholders, consistency and wealth maximization. So these are the objectives of a good dividend policy. What are the factors influencing dividend policy? Stability of earnings, age of the firm, regular unstable dividends, time of payment of dividend. Stability of earnings. When a company gets regular earnings, consistent earnings, it will be able to pay consistent dividends. Age of the firm. A new firm will not be able to pay high dividends as an old or an established firm. Regular and stability of dividends. When a company makes a stable dividends, people expect, the shareholders expect similar dividends, and regular stability of dividend payments is also another factor influencing dividend policy. Time of payment of dividend. When the company is going for an improvement or its cash demand is high, the company pays lesser cash dividends. Whereas if the company has surplus cash, it would go for cash dividends. Liquidity of funds. The availability of cash for distribution of dividends is very important determinant factor. If the company has already engaged itself in capital intensive projects of construction, then they may not have adequate funds to distribute dividends. They may go for bonus dividends. Policy of control. Some managements do not prefer to have additional shareholders to invest in their company. Such conservative managements want to control their operations, and therefore they pay less dividends. Loan repayments. When a company's burden on loan repayment is very high, they will prefer to go for a lower dividend. Government policies. Government can fix or cap the amount or percentage of dividend that can be paid. The legal requirements. The distribution of dividends are subject to tax. So the legal requirements in distribution of dividends are also one of the important factors that affects the dividend policy. Trade cycles like depression, recovery, prosperity and recession also decide or impact the dividend policies of a company. The need for additional capital. When you need additional capital, the company would like to retain the profits and not pay much dividend. Ability to borrow at lower rates. If the company can borrow at lower rates, it would prefer to go for high dividends. Past dividends. If the company has given good dividends in the past, it has to retain the same position now also. Taxability of dividends was already discussed. To summarize, the factors influencing dividend policy can be classified as internal and external. Stability of earnings, age of corporation, liquidity of funds, extent of SAT distribution, needs for additional capital, trade cycles, past dividends, ability to borrow, policy of control, repayment of loans, time of payment of dividend, regularity and stability in dividend payment, or internal factors, legal requirements, government policies and taxation policy, or external factors. So there are different types of dividend policies. Generous dividend policy. Generous dividend policy where a company pays a good amount of dividends to keep its shareholders satisfied. That is called a generous dividend policy. Stable dividend policy. Stable dividend policy, the company has a systematic way of paying dividends. There are three different types of stable dividend policy. One is constant dividend per share. Constant dividend per share, a fixed amount is paid on each share. Let us say for the 10% dividend, rupees 10 is paid on every 100 rupees. Payout ratio, see a percentage of the earnings is paid as dividends. Let us say 50% of the earnings. If the company makes a profit of 10 lakhs, 5 lakhs is paid out to the shareholders as dividend. Constant dividend per share plus additional dividend. This is a combination of the both, where a fixed percent of, let us say, rupees 10 is paid plus a variable component which depends upon the earnings of the company. So all these come under the first. All these come under your stable dividend policy. Constant dividend per share, payout ratio and constant dividend per share plus additional dividends on earnings. Conservative policy, where the company decides to pay lesser in spite of having good profits. So conservative policy is followed where they want to hold control. Erratic policy, when the company earns good profits, it pays good dividend, and when the company earns low profits, it may pay lesser. It depends upon the management. So such kind of an erratic policy may also be followed in some cases. So there are companies who do not have very strict, rigid dividend policies. Summary. So the dividend is, what is the dividend? Dividend is a return to the shareholders on their investment, to both the equity and the preference shareholders. It is paid out of the profits of the company. So what is a dividend policy? A dividend policy is a structure of dividend payout to the shareholders. It decides how the company distributes its profits to its shareholders and retains its earnings. What are the objectives of dividend policies? providing sufficient finance at low cost, good return to shareholders, wealth maximization, and then consistency. The factors of dividend policies we have discussed at length. Thank you. We will stop this video here.